in these dog days of summer, as they say, these final weeks before school resumes and office hours lengthen, many of you, I hope, have taken a vacation. Many of our friends who are usually in the chairs and pews alongside us, and even our senior minister, are taking such a vacation as we speak. It is an expectation to some extent in our place and culture that we all aspire to take a vacation at least once a year, even though we know that Americans take far fewer vacation days than those in Europe, for example, and many of us leave earned vacation days untouched. So why do we take vacations? Is it for rest? I know that my toddler woke up at the same time, if not earlier, on vacation as he does at home. So I, like many of you, probably get the same amount of sleep, whether I'm in Montclair or Manasquan. And I know from talking to many of you that many vacations are so jam-packed, exploring new cities or parks, art museums and tours and hikes, that your Fitbits probably record many more steps while you're away than at home. So while rest is hopefully part of our vacations, I doubt it's the only reason. Our vacations bring rest, but they also bring freedom. Freedom from schedules and commutes, office chairs and classrooms, from expectations of home-cooked meals or emails answered, from church attendance, as well as soccer practice. So our scripture today explores the purpose of the Sabbath. And while vacations are not the same as Sabbath, we've come so far from honoring Sabbath in our weekly routines, generally speaking, that I think in our culture we best understand Sabbath when we think about the purposes of our vacations. So in this passage from Luke, we hear a snippet of an ongoing argument from the 1st century among many Jewish communities, an argument into which Jesus often waded about what the Sabbath is for. Is Sabbath about not working? Or is it about celebrating the freedom to not work and giving thanks to God for that freedom? So our understanding of Sabbath is often tied to the creation story in Genesis, when God creates all heaven and earth and all things in it, and on the seventh day, God rests. It is good, God declares, and therefore God rests. But the Exodus version of the Ten Commandments affirms this theological understanding. But Sabbath is not just a day of rest, even in the Bible. It's not just a recognition that even God takes a break sometimes, or a celebration just of God's goodness and the goodness of creation. There's another element that the scriptures emphasize and that Jesus in the Gospel of Luke is rather emphatic about. And it is related to this story. That after Moses leads his people out of Egypt, out of bondage under Pharaoh's rule, after God has recruited Moses and Aaron and Miriam, has hardened Pharaoh's heart, and has worked 7 plagues to free the Israelites, then God delivers the 10 Commandments as we get in the book of Deuteronomy. And the first commandment God issues is this, that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. The defining feature of God for the Israelites is that God was their liberator. And so the commandment in the book of Deuteronomy to observe the Sabbath repeats, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So the Sabbath is not just a recognition of God's general goodness, but a celebration of freedom. And what difference it makes to lift up the Sabbath as a celebration of freedom, to cease from labor in recognition that you are no longer forced to labor. You are no longer bound, but are freed by God to rest. What difference it might make to try to honor the Sabbath in our own time, not out of obligation to God to rest, but in celebration of the Sabbath, in recognition of that freedom. Freedom, material freedoms that we enjoy in this community, in this country, and the freedom that we find through the grace of a God who loves us so much, that God wants us and all people to be liberated from all the bondages that still exist, material and existential. In this sense, each Sunday might come to feel like a small Juneteenth, the holiday that many African American people honor, but largely overlooked, that recognizes the day that the news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached enslaved people all the way in Texas, 2.5 years after Lincoln had announced it. Or maybe it would feel like a small Passover, when Jewish people honor God's commandment to tell the story of the Exodus. Whatever the tradition of celebrating liberation and freedom is for you, many of our Sabbaths feel more like one more obligation, even if it is an obligation to rest, than it does a celebration of our freedom. We have come a long way from the days when businesses were closed on Sundays, when one could expect that there would be no other obligations than church attendance on the Lord's Day. We have come a long way from communal participation in the Sabbath in the Christian tradition, and in many ways our Jewish siblings in faith have maintained their commitment to Sabbath practice more diligently than Christians. And as our religious tradition of honoring the Sabbath has weakened, so too have our cultural and workplace commitments to this practice. It's been a long time since factory and garment workers struggled in this country and others to limit working hours on weekends and shorten the workday. And for many years, hours have encroached in all sectors, from finance to fast food, whether because of expectations of white-collar workers to be on call all the time, or the need for low-wage workers to work multiple jobs to earn a living. I have long liked the bumper sticker, "The labor movement, the folks who brought you the weekend." But our religious traditions, Jewish and Christian and others, have had as much influence on curtailing the encroach of work into our worship and recreational time. It's perhaps only our ancient traditions that serve as the barrier to the ever-encroaching tide of total productivity. Even students have felt the creep of constant productivity into their school days and extracurricular lives. The Atlantic ran a piece this week about the problem of the meritocracy that included this anecdote. At one elite Northeastern elementary school, a teacher posted a problem of the day, which students had to solve before going home, even though no time was set aside to work on it. The point of the exercise was to train 5th graders to snatch a few extra minutes of work time by multitasking or by sacrificing recess. So all of us, at an increasingly young age, are trained to be constantly on the treadmill of self-improvement, optimization, and efficiency. Our success depends on it, we are told. But at what cost? The freedom to be whatever we want to be is only real if we also have the freedom to not be stressed, to not be exhausted or disappointed. If we have the freedom to rejoice in the days that God has made for us to be glad in them. It's not just a desire to rest that fuels our drive to resist the takeover of our time by work, but also a human need for freedom, a human need for time that is our own. And this is a struggle. I don't know a single Christian, clergy included, who spend a day every week solely in worship and rest, phone and email silenced, housework set aside, perhaps even refraining from using their car or staying within a few blocks of their home. When I was hired last year, I was asked about my Sabbath practice, which is a form of clergy responsibility and care. And I confess that I struggled to figure out what that looked like as a new parent. The ancient Sabbath customs and rules include cooking and housework as out of bounds. In that spirit, I think that the work of raising children is both a joy and also work. How could you stop changing diapers or doing laundry? How would you give up that one precious day when both adults in the house are home and not working for a few hours and ask us not to take advantage of it for household chores? It felt impossible. And in reframing Sabbath as not just a restriction about work, but as a celebration of freedom that we have in God, is it easier to imagine how it might look in our lives? If 5 or 6 days a week we are bound to office hours and emails and school and activities and chores and housework and shopping and looking a certain way and bowing down to the way things are, how can we liberate ourselves from those ought-tos for one day a week? How can we stop doing the things that don't serve God, that don't sustain life and set us free? How can we carve out time to reset our focus on the liberation that God wants for God's people? One answer, at least in today's parlance, has been self-care. Self-care has been a cultural phenomenon in recent years that has made it okay at times to take time for oneself, especially for women. But even self-care has become an industry of itself, with potions and products and Instagram hashtags and Pinterest ideas and resorts and spas making lucrative even the concept of rest. Now, it is good and holy to take care of oneself. But we should be careful not to reduce the concept of Sabbath to fit within the wellness industry's ideas of self-care. Because Sabbath is not primarily about care of oneself, but care of God's community. And Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, over and over makes a point of healing in the synagogue on Sabbath. His point is that Sabbath is about people being set free. That people were set free by God under Pharaoh's rule, and that we can set each other free too. It's a story that differs from other healing stories. It's not necessarily about the miraculousness of Jesus' healing power. Many healing stories hinge around a test or a proclamation of faith, and we don't get that here. This woman has been living in bondage for 18 years. And the miracle is that she is now free to praise God fully in the life of the community. So if Sabbath is not just about painting your nails and watching Netflix, what is it? For a number of years after college, I worked in restaurants and the service industry, and almost every Sunday was taken up with work. Now, I had plenty of free time and days off, plenty of time for rest on other days of the week. And without kids, I was even free to go to brunch on a weekday or sleep in on a day off. But I found that even though I had free time, I was missing something. And when I finally found myself in a church pew on a Sunday morning once again, there it was. It wasn't endless rest that I needed. It was a message of freedom, the grace proclaimed in the Gospels, the liberation imagined by the prophets. This was the freedom that my soul longed for. And perhaps the woman enabled by Jesus to stand up straight in our story today needed that too. Maybe more than a miracle, she needed someone to see her, to really notice her and the burdens that she carried, and to lend a hand to help set her free from them. Because even when our external conditions limit our sense of freedom, the grace of God reminds us that we have in our own selves and our communities a capacity to be free even when we materially are not. It's what the great Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl attests to in his memoir, Man's Search for Meaning. Describing the capacity of people around him living in concentration camps, he wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms. To choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. It is this spiritual freedom, which cannot be taken away, that makes life meaningful and purposeful. An active life serves the purpose of giving man the opportunity to realize values in creative work, while a passive life of enjoyment affords him the opportunity to obtain fulfillment in experiencing beauty, art, or nature. But there is also purpose in that life, which is almost barren of both creation and enjoyment, and in which admits of but one possibility of high moral behavior, namely, in man's attitude to his existence, an existence restricted by external forces." It's sobering to imagine the possibility of spiritual freedom in the midst of such atrocity and suffering. And yet, his powerful witness serves as a reminder that in a humbling spirit, We can be free in any place, in any moment. So maybe more than a commandment to rest, you too could use an invitation to be free. An invitation to unload the burdens that you are carrying, to be seen and celebrating as yourself. The Sabbath calls us to live into the freedoms we have and the freedoms we can imagine. So what kind of Sabbath would that be? One in which we can unload the burdens we carry, seek freedom from the stresses and strains of the world, imagine being a part of the liberation of all kingdom, and one in which we can be lifted by the grace that God offers us every day. A hymn sung at a friend's ordination proclaimed, "In desperation we found freedom. In freedom we found love. In love we found devotion. And in devotion, Spirit found us." May you find freedom. May your freedom lead you to new forms of love and devotion that feed your soul. And may this Sabbath be a place of freedom, rejoicing always in the grace given to us, unburdened, at least for today.